That totally makes sense. It's like it was a new technology for Gen X and millennials who were technologically literate.
Yeah.
So they were excited and wanted to share and use social media, whatever. Then boomers kind of were like, they missed the bus, so they don't use it. And then Zoomers grew up being like, oh, well, all the old people are using this, so we're going to be more private and use like Snapchat and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, are more conservative from the research that I've seen.
But that does surprise me though, that the Zoomers would answer that question the same as the Boomers. I'm trying to like rationalize it and figure out why they'd be aligned, but I really don't know. I don't think that makes sense the way that I explained it. I don't know why they would be answering that question right. I can understand why Boomers would answer the question right because they lived through the depreciation.
Right.
But Gen Z, the only reason I could think would be because maybe the politicians and stuff talk about it, but I don't even think they talk about this.
Yeah.
Like the only people who talk about the dollar losing purchasing power are usually like conservatives or like the people on the right, like Fox News and stuff like that talks about the dollar and the debt and things like that. And most Zoomers aren't watching that. They're looking at Bernie and AOC and stuff. And I don't think they ever talk about economic stuff much.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting.
Well, we learned something.
Yeah, and we'll see that even as the survey goes on. So, and again, so we're going to look at the economic classes, and what is wild is that wealthy are extremely more likely than any others to believe that the US dollar has gained purchasing power. So they 58% of them compared to the average of 28%. So 58% of wealthy people think that it's gained purchasing power. And this is again just another example of wealthy people really connecting to the very positive, like boisterous statements and feel more connected to that. So,
and you know what, that probably is also an effect of the S&P 500 and like the stock market going on a tear over the last, well, really, the stock market has been on a 100-year bull run, including recessions. So even during times of recession, if you've had your money in the S&P 500 or whatever, and you didn't take it out, and you had it invested in a passive index or something, you're increasing your wealth. So it's continuing to go up and up and up. So the wealthy are probably getting some exposure to the stock market, seeing it go up, and they're probably equating that with the dollar, thinking that, oh, well, if the stock market's going up, then the dollar must be going up.
Yeah.
Even though they don't realize that the dollar is losing its purchasing power because it's been inflated like thousands of percent in that same time that the stock market went up.
Right. And it's going to be interesting to see that question that we end up asking about like the 30x and the 15x once we get there. I'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on that question also.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we asked them, would you be surprised to learn that the US dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power over the last 100 years compared to gold? What is interesting is that we have about 40% of the population that doesn't want to believe it. And
30% say that's fake news. I love it.
Yeah. Which is interesting. I think they just like don't know if this is something that they should be trusting, right? They're not like, hey, this, you know.
It naturally feels like that's fake news. It doesn't feel right.
Yeah, totally.
So that's why I wanted to have that question in there, because with the fake news meme that's been going for the last few years, I mean, that does feel like fake news. When you hear that, it doesn't sound right.
Yeah, that's crazy. Actually, it feels so foreign to think that the US dollar lost like almost 100% of its purchasing power that you're like, no, that's fake. That's fake news.
Yeah, that's fake.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, 30% of the people converted. Like they did, because the answer is I believe it, and it's shocking. As in, like, they didn't realize it, but now they realize it. So.
Yeah. So on that, so that I believe it and it's shocking. I'll actually send you something else, because I believe it and it's shocking, and the wealthy were actually the most likely in this situation. They were at like 68% of being like, I believe it and it's shocking, which also just shows that as a demographic, the wealthy were the most receptive to this new information, and we're like, oh, actually that makes sense. which is
Did you
just
happen to, because it would make sense to me that the boomers were also the most wealthy. Did you have any data on that?
ooh,
Because
yeah.
if the boomers were the most wealthy and the wealthy were the most to shift their mind, and it would make sense that the boomers are the most wealthy because they've got generational wealth being passed down to them from the silent generation. So it would naturally make sense that they're more wealthy, and they've
Yeah.
had houses during the increase of the housing boom, and they've had exposure to the stock market for most of their life. So it would make sense that boomers are the most wealthy. Boomers were the ones that changed their mind the most on Bitcoin, and I believe it, and it's shocking, had a 60% increase. That would make sense if it was also boomers.
Yeah, so the boomers were actually not the most wealthy demographic from what I remember, but I think you can see my screen, so I'm just going to look it up real quick. Which generation are you part of, and what economic class do you consider yourself in? So if we just look at the age cohorts, funny enough, boomers who took the survey were more likely to be low income.
Oh,
Gen
really?
X, yeah, was so the Gen X and millennial generation were would be wealthier.
Okay.
But we did weight it differently so that this effect wouldn't be present in the actual results for the age cohorts. So that's something
Okay.
that we did balance for.
Makes sense.
Um, but even though boomers, on average would be wealthier, let's say like the people taking the survey, those boomers weren't necessarily like
Right.
happen. Yeah. Um, Okay, so question 26. If you adjust for the drop in purchasing power of $1, what do you think your return would be? And that was part of a larger question about being able to buy pizza for $2 in 1970, but a pizza now being $20 in present day, and the S&P being at, I think it was $92 in 1970, but now it was up to 3,100. So we were asking them, if you would adjust for the drop of purchasing power, what would their return be? And will you tell everyone what the right answer would be?
I think it's like, if I remember correctly, it's a 3x that you would
Yeah,
have gotten, even though it's
30.
feels like a 30x. Like you would have gotten a 30x in dollars, but your purchasing power would have only increased 3x.
Yeah, exactly. So the right answer was 3x, and only 50% of the people were able to do that. It was kind of a math question,
Yeah.
um, which I enjoyed because I did it. But yeah, it was only 15% of the people that got that right. Quite a bit were,
15,
yeah,
15%, right? Yeah, and that's expected because most people, like, by the previous answers, if most people think that the dollar has either retained or gained its purchasing power, and the debt is like either nothing or like lower than you think it is, and answering these questions where people don't understand, it makes sense that they wouldn't get that a significant loss in purchasing power when
yeah,
you equate that to the increase of the stock market over the last 30, 40 years. It
right.
actually makes it so you didn't do very well.
Yeah, instead of getting 30 times your money back, you really only got 3 times your money back, which is um, quite different.
And I
Uh,
bet you that's probably another one of the aha moments where the wealthy people who are in the stock market, who probably are getting good returns over time, as they relate the returns with the debt and the loss in purchasing power, it probably hits them more in like their financial part of the brain, where they probably understand, okay, even though I'm getting these gains, the longer I stay in the stock market, the less purchasing power I have. So I need to start thinking about storing my wealth in an inflation resistant asset class.
right. Oh, that's really interesting, right? Yeah,
That's
inflation.
what I would expect, anyways. If someone was really thinking about these questions as they go through and they're learning, the debt's crazy, the dollar's been printed like nuts. Even though I'm up in the stocks, my purchasing power is down. Um, I need to start thinking about store of wealth and preparing, to see more of this happening over time.
Yeah, so I'm curious, is Bitcoin inflation resistant?
Well, it's not. It is a it's a hedge against inflation because it doesn't have cap, or sorry, it has a supply cap and it doesn't have an inflation schedule. So there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. And so because there's not going to be more printed once the cap hits, it's more like gold in that way, where there's no guy can come in and say, I actually want to print another million Bitcoin like we do with fiat money.
Right.
And so that can't deflate the value of each existing Bitcoin. So savers and even investors in the US stock market and in most developed countries, they're being punished every year by the government's printing more money. Their savings are being dwindled. Even though it's the same amount of dollars, it's less, it can buy less.
Yeah.
And so Bitcoin is resistant to that. I mean, it's not like, it's not like a feature or something. Like, it's just naturally, like gold, resistant to the effects of inflation through money printing.
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. And so so if the cap is 21 million, do we know how many Bitcoin have been like created already?
Yeah, it's around 18.5 million, I think, right now.
Okay.
And so most of the Bitcoin are going to be mined by 2040 or so. And then the rest of the Bitcoin it'll take 100 years for them to be mined, because every 4 years, the amount of new Bitcoin issued drops by half.
Oh.
Yeah, so the supply gets shocked and reduced every 4 years, and then that makes it more competitive for the miners. And it's modeled after real gold mining, and that's the only reason it's like that. It's kind of confusing, but once you get into it and you understand it, like gold mining, when they find a new vein of gold or a new deposit of gold, it could add a significant amount of gold into the total supply of gold. So like a couple of years ago, China found this crazy huge reserve of gold that would have added like 5 to 10% more gold into the total supply of gold in the world. And then they have to start mining it and whatever. So that's called the stock to flow ratio. And it basically just means that there's an unknown variable of how much gold is being mined. And then it is like ever increasing. And like some companies are actually starting to explore asteroid mining. And if you find an asteroid, and there are asteroids like this that have like more gold on them than the whole supply of gold on Earth, you can go and mine that asteroid and bring it back, and it'll like double the supply of gold on Earth. I mean, that's not going to be a good thing for gold, but we're a little bit away from that actually being a risk to gold.
Wait, that's so cool. Wait, but this hasn't been done yet. This is just an idea, right? Asteroid.
Yeah, I mean, it's being developed. I think Jeff Bezos from Amazon is behind one of these companies. I think I heard that James Cameron is behind one too. But yeah, there's like trillions of dollars worth of gold in these asteroids, and if they can find a way to safely go mine it and bring it back, then it's going to really increase the supply of gold.
Ha! That's so cool. I love this.
But I mean, it's unlikely. I mean, that's like a tail hedge risk that they're going to succeed in our lifetime in doing that. But still, it's possible. But with Bitcoin, there's a programmatic amount of Bitcoin that ahead of time what the inflation schedule is going to be like for the next 100 years. And so it's the first thing in history where we know what for the next 100 years, how much of this commodity there's going to be. And it's just a fight between the miners to get that Bitcoin. So that's why there's so many Bitcoin miners now. The Bitcoin network is the most secure network on the planet. There's more people mining Bitcoin than computers that secure Google and the US government.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then they're all competing to get this small amount of Bitcoin. And the biggest thing that's going to happen coming up is the halving, which is in, I think, May or June. And then it goes from 16, I think it's at 16.5 Bitcoin right now, or 12.5 Bitcoin right now. And it goes down to 6.25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's why it's inflation resistant, because there's a schedule and we know what it's going to be for the next 100 years. And right now it's a higher inflation than gold, and it's going to be a lower inflation than gold this year. So it's going to kind of cross that chasm of being lower inflation than gold.